Hi, I'm Alan Rusbridger, editor of Prospect Magazine, and you're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of Media Confidential with myself and Lionel Barber, in which we speak to a special guest. If you want to watch the full episode, please click on the link below, and if you want to subscribe to Prospect Magazine, please visit our website at www.prospectmagazine.co.uk. Enjoy.
Well, we're delighted to be joined by Michael Lewis, the global best-selling author. His books include The Big Short, which was turned into an Oscar-winning movie, all about the global financial crisis and the oddballs therein, and also the author of Liar's Poker, which I remember reading when I was in Washington many years ago and enjoying that immensely. That's a sort of book about greed on Wall Street in the 1980s. Remember the Gordon Gekko figure, and it's all about Salomon Brothers, where actually Michael worked. Now, his new book, out now in paperback, is Going Infinite, which is the story of Sam Bankman-Fried, the cryptocurrency trader who was, I think, the richest man in the world under 30, and certainly maybe the fastest wealth creator in recorded history. Now, Michael, why did you decide to write a book about SBF?
It started, like a lot of my books, just as an accident. I'd never heard of him or FTX, and I had next to no interest in writing about cryptocurrency, despite entreaties from lots of cryptocurrency people who like to be written about. A friend of mine asked me to evaluate him because my friend was going to swap $300 million of shares in his company for $300 million of shares in FTX. And so he came by my house one day, and I spent a couple of hours with him. And in a couple of hours, it was clear there were a couple of things that got my interest. Though I wasn't thinking exactly book. I was just kind of thinking, I just wonder where this is going to go. The fact that he had generated at that point, according to Forbes magazine, $22 billion in about 18 months, and that he had managed to earn the trust of lots of really important people. He was mixing it up with both Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell in the Senate. He was Biden's second biggest donor. Some of the most famous people on the planet were sponsoring his crypto exchange. And
Tony Blair on stage.
Tony Blair was
Bill
coming.
Clinton.
It was the speed with which the world had configured itself around this pile of money. I said to him, I just want to kind of watch. But without knowing where it was going to lead. So I didn't set out to write a biography of Sam Bankman-Fried.
So just describe him. I mean, you specialize in writing about oddballs, but this is the oddball to beat all oddballs.
It really is. First, his kind of circumstances. I asked him right away, could he give me a list of people who knew him before the age of 18, who could give me some help and who he was? And I got his mother, his father, not his brother, and one person who was maybe a friend. And that it quickly found out that he had this incredibly isolated childhood, even though his parents were, well-known professors of law on the Stanford campus. And so there was a peculiarity of his background and how he had, in spite of being basically socially isolated and not raised as a money person and not oddly all that interested in money, had stumbled into Wall Street as a high-frequency trader because they had found him, basically. He had an aptitude. And he was good. He was good at games, good at quantitative games, good at whatever it was that made someone good at high-frequency trading. But he had the bigger thing about him was, I don't know what the neurodiversity is. I mean, he was diagnosed during his trial with autism, but I don't quite believe that. He doesn't read to me in this way that the autistic people I've known read. They're more complicated. Like, I haven't found the diagnosis that completely fits him, but he just moves through it. It was clearly a case that, and I knew this right from the beginning, whatever happened to him, one of the interesting things was watching this mind that insisted on trying to turn everything into a mathematical calculation, every decision he made, and an emotional infrastructure that, unlike any I had met, he didn't feel things. He would quite open about it. Like, he doesn't feel your pain, and he doesn't feel his own pain. and kind of that he was interacting with the world strangely because of these
But
things.
these are very special circumstances, Michael, because you start with checking him out and suddenly you find yourself in the middle of a true crime thriller.
Yeah, no, it was more complicated than that
Because,
one way.
The whole thing blows up, FTX blows up.
While I'm on the watch.
While you're on the watch. Now, here's the problem. I want to talk about approach, because you are a brilliant writer. You've written best-selling novels, but you're in effect an embed. And access can be double-edged, can't it?
Not really.
No.
No, I don't owe him anything. By the time I sit down to write the thing, I don't actually go to my publisher and say, I have a book, until it blows up. So I was prepared I wasn't sure that I had anything because I couldn't figure out where it was going. I watched it for the better part of a year and did all the things a journalist does: interview friends, enemies, colleagues, investors, all that stuff, and spent a lot of time with him kind of gathering the sort of material one would for a book. But I didn't have a book. And once I would say almost the opposite, what you're suggesting, that it is true that with all my subjects, I have to embed. I mean, I have to really get to know them. But with all my subjects, none of them read the thing before it comes out.
No,
nobody has any kind of control over what I'm going to write. And in his case, by the time I sat down to write, he was a wholly discredited person who was in jail. So I had absolutely no handcuffs. I could write whatever I wanted. So I felt freer maybe than I've ever been to do whatever I wanted to do. Not that I haven't felt completely free. The exception, the only pressure on me when I sat down to write was the whole world hated him. And it was going to be difficult to get him across in that environment because, in fact, before it all went bad, the whole world loved him. And so you had to kind of explain why that was. But no, I didn't feel any kind of.
I mean, I'm speaking as a longtime reporter, and it'd be interesting what Alan thinks, and also as an editor who interviewed many world figures and top business people. And obviously, if you go in and have privileged access, it can be double-edged.
If there's some sort of agreement,
no agreement.
I mean, I can't see any downside to knowing more. It's just all about knowing more. And I don't feel constrained in any way. No. I mean, the worst thing is having a kind of very distant understanding of your subject. I mean, I feel like I need to get to the point with the subject so I can almost predict what they're going to do. And you can't do it unless you spend a lot of time with them.
So if I get the narrative right, Michael, the first edition of the book comes out as SBF goes on trial.
The day of the trial.
The day of the amazing timing. And then he gets convicted. And I just want to take you through some criticism of the book. So I think, to be completely fair, even your critics say this is a brilliantly written book. It's a sort of an incredible story that you've told. But there's a undertow in some of the reviews, not all of them, that you were in a way taken in. And so there's I don't know if you read your own reviews, but there's a review in the LA Times by Michael Hiltznick. Are you familiar with this?
I'm not. I don't read the reviews, but before you go on with this, it's all horseshit.
Okay,
I'm sorry. This is all written by people who don't know anything.
Okay.
But so why am I listening to this?
My job is to put you
Is it really?
So
that's your job.
It's my job.
All right. Let's see how well you do it.
So he says journalism schools will be able to use this book in future as a textbook on the imperative need to approach a subject with a healthy helping of skepticism. To make a long story short, in this book, Lewis doesn't exercise any. So his criticism of your book is that you were pulled into this story, you were beguiled by this incredible character, and you lost your critical faculties.
I don't know. So, I mean, as you know, people write reviews for all sorts of reasons. I think this is one of my best books. And I don't, you got to remember, I don't start writing this till he's in jail. I don't sell it till after he is, arrested. So it's not like I don't know what happened. I have the advantage of having been there and watched it. And my job was to sort of describe it to the reader as it happened. I think a couple of things are responsible for that kind of review. One is people who don't know very much are quick to form opinions, and they formed opinions and express them. We now have mechanisms for expressing opinions when you don't have much understanding, social media. And so people
This guy's a Pulitzer Prize winning financial journalist,
but he doesn't know anything about this in particular. He hasn't. He didn't even sit down with Sam Bankman-Fried. He doesn't know anything. So the idea that you could come at someone who spent a year immersed in the subject and interviewed hundreds of people around it, including all his critics, and say, "Oh, this book is a result of a lack of skepticism," as opposed to a result of far more knowledge. It's preposterous. It's preposterous. And so let me just finish.
Yeah.
If you're going to say idiot things, I will say idiot. I've got to respond. I think this is foolish. So the second thing is the book comes out. The people who knew him best were perhaps the people who were most damaged by him, particularly the people right around him in the company, but also his investors, people like that. To a person, they said to me, "You nailed it. You completely nailed this character." And it is such an act of folly to try to sort of kowtow, curry favor with an ignorant audience as opposed to an intelligent, informed audience. The book completely, there's been not a criticism from anybody who knows anything about what happened. Furthermore, if I had written the book that like he would like have me write, where you basically tip your hand in the very beginning and say, "Oh, it's so obvious to me this guy was evil and committing fraud and whatever," and making some vast moral judgment about him, you would have completely ruined the experience for the reader. Because what the reader needed to do was experience what the world experienced and be enamored of Sam Bankman-Fried, or at least have the possibility of being sympathetic towards him. Because if they don't do that, they can never understand why it happened in the first place. It only happens because a raft of very important people think this guy is the best. So I just described that. Now, it's true, a lot of people were bamboozled by him, that they didn't read him completely right. They gave him money. They went to work for him. They wrote flattering articles about him when he was riding high. I didn't do that.
But I'm interested in the writing process, because there's another, my old colleague Emma Brox at the Guardian, who again is very flattering about the book. In fact, she's so flattering. You quote her on the dust jacket.
I don't have anything to do with it.
But she also says, one feels for Mr. Lewis, as I'm quoting her, having to reassess mid-project someone he clearly likes and respects. My question would be why he regarded Bankman-Fried with such indulgence in the first place. I suppose the critique is
that along with everybody else.
You were quite. So at what point you're clearly fascinated by this character, or you wouldn't have embarked on the book?
I'm still fascinated by him.
At what point did you think, hold on a minute?
The fact that he's got his customers' deposits, $11 billion of them, in his private hedge fund is revealed, I had two reactions. One was, this is so dumb, because the source of his wealth was this crypto exchange and not his private hedge fund. The private hedge fund was not necessary to the crypto exchange. The crypto exchange he started it by accident, but it was not, there wasn't an organic relationship. The crypto exchange didn't need the hedge fund. Hedge fund might in the end needed the crypto exchange. So and this is why nobody saw it coming. I mean, it is a remarkable thing about this fraud, that you don't have anybody out there, before it happens saying, here's the problem, like predicting it. With Madoff, you had Harry Markopolos. You had people who could look at the math and say, there's something not right here. You had people saying, oh, it's crypto, there's probably something squirrely with it, but that's different. So my first thought was this: it's so dumb because he didn't need to do this. Like he could still be the world's richest person.
When was the moment?
Can I finish?
Yeah.
So that's the first thought. The second thought is, it falls perfectly into the narrative, such as it is so far, because this thing that as I imagine the story up to that point, it's chaos. It's pure chaos. It's this person who's generating these semi-chaotic environments, and who had, when he created his crypto trading firm, done something very similar. And I had all that. So it kind of like tracked with what I knew of him and sort of fit into the picture. So I didn't think of, I have to change my opinion of him. I thought, he's made this horrible mistake, but it actually is of a piece with all the other pieces.
And you'd invested in him personally?
No,
you hadn't put money into his enterprise.
Like $1,000 to see if it worked.
Yeah.
I just had to see if it worked.
Yeah.
I think it is a very deep, nuanced, and sophisticated analysis of a character. And I got right in it. I think the problem is when you assess what happened. In the epilogue, you suggest actually that FTX, the money might actually have been there, and that actually the whole enterprises weren't necessarily insolvent. Is that correct?
Well, you've seen what happened, right? So when it all blows up, there is almost instantly a secondary market in claims on FTX, meaning if you were a depositor with money on it, you could have sold the right to that claim. And the market in the very beginning just assumed, idiotically, that there was nothing there, that he'd vaporized the $11 billion. And you could, if you were going to sell your claim, you could have gotten 5 cents on the dollar for it. And even then, I knew that was false. If I was just in it for the money, I would have just bought up FTX claims. Because what people didn't understand was, like, the narrative in the media, the stupid stuff, was like, we spent it on condominiums in the Bahamas and private jets and all the stuff that rich people crooks normally spend things on. It was pretty clear what he had done largely is accumulate a vast venture capital portfolio that he had that when he accumulated it, he thought he was accumulating it with not his customers' funds, but eventually it ends up being his customers' funds that are funding this. And all that stuff was sitting there. Right. And in that pile of stuff was like a 20% stake in Anthropic, the AI company, and big chunk of SpaceX.
Which is worth a lot of money now.
It's worth billions. And so right now, the claims, I just had a note the other day from a hedge fund manager who trades these claims. The claims are trading at 125 cents on the dollar. So hedge funds are buying them. So they think there's going to be more than 125 cents on the dollar return. So anybody who's just sitting there like me with a claim on FTX is going to get all their money back and more. Right. So that's a fact. This is a complicated fact. And it's a fact that actually did never make it into the courtroom in his trial.
You are, though, a very experienced observer of oddballs and business. And I put it to you that I sound like a lawyer, Michael. That's a bit dangerous. I put it to you. Here you are. You're in the Bahamas. I mean, isn't it a huge red flag that FTX and SBF are based in the Bahamas?
Well, it was Hong Kong even a red flag.
I know, but light regulation, light touch, it doesn't...
Well,
isn't that a red flag?
The problem is they couldn't get themselves regulated in the United States. He wanted to move it to the United States. So you got to remember how does this start? It starts, he's in Berkeley, California to start with. So he starts his business in the States. It's a crypto hedge fund. When he stumbles into the idea of, I'm going to create an exchange, it actually isn't. He doesn't think he's going to run it. He thinks he's going to create it and sell it to some other exchange so he can trade on it, because there are no professional graded crypto exchanges. When no one will buy it and he's in the position of, where do I start this thing? He starts it in Hong Kong. And the reason they'd moved from Hong Kong to the Bahamas was Hong Kong was heating up politically, that there was a fear that like the Chinese government was going to come in and arrest them. So leaving Hong Kong wasn't a red flag. The question was, and the question of where they put it, it wasn't just, oh, let's just move it to the Bahamas because it's light regulation. It was there were a handful of places they looked at, and it was all light regulation because that's where you set up a crypto exchange. So I don't think the fact it was in the Bahamas suggested it was like some sort of criminal enterprise. And interestingly, it is true that like the Bahamas is not going to regulate a financial exchange as rigorously as say the United States. But the regulators there, I think they were trying. I think it was hard to see. I think you need, because among other things, I mean, this is all a function of crypto as a space. You couldn't get a decent accountant to come in and audit these places. Like I interviewed all the big accountants, none of them will touch crypto. So you couldn't get the kind of forensic eyes on the problem that you would want to see the problem. So, I mean, the Bahamas, I don't know. He moved to the Bahamas because he was hoping to move it to the States, and he was trying to get as close to the States as possible.
And then there were the badminton courts and stuff. But let's just talk about what I would call the Silicon Valley mentality. And that was summed up by one quote in this book that you've got here from Sam Bankman-Fried. He says, fault is just a construct of human society.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
I mean, that's his mother in utilitarianism.
But what do you make of that?
I mean, do I think that fault is just a construct of human society? No. I do think I have, when I look at this sort of situation, I'm probably less of a prosecutorial mindset than I am of a public defender mindset, a little bit, because I tend to be maybe more sensitive to situation rather than character. I think character, people who are really focused on bad guy does bad thing, usually I think miss the point that the bad guy in a slightly different situation might not have been a bad guy. You change the incentives, you change the situation, you change the regulation, you get a different outcome. Sam Bankman-Fried, there was nothing in Sam Bankman-Fried's history, like personal history, as a kid, as a student, as a trader at Jane Street, to suggest that he was like going to be a giant fraud. I don't think he was born to like defraud people, but it is true that it probably helped him a little bit that he didn't think about morality the way most people think about morality.
So this is the magic moment where I get to quote late 19th century French. Tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner. To understand
is to pardon. And it is, but it is true that the more you understand, the more sympathetic you're likely to be.
And you were deep into the understanding of this character.
I mean, I think, don't you want to understand, right? Is the point not to understand?
No, I completely agree with you. Yeah, I mean, having just written I think this is the plug in.
moment where you can plug your
having
plug
spent
your
3 years trying to understand the greatest risk taker, one of the greatest risk takers in recent times, this Japanese media technology investor, Masayoshi Son. Absolutely, am I trying to understand where does this bottomless risk appetite come from?
Where did it come from?
Outsider, desperate, a nobody, man who lives under an alias in Japan, born in a slum. Mr. Nobody wants to be Mr. Somebody, goes on a journey, goes to California, learns English and goes back and wants to show everybody I can make it. And I'm prepared because I never had anything.
Right.
If I lose everything, I'm just going back to where I was.
And he really feels that way.
He does.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a version. The Sam Bankman-Fried rhymes with that a bit, right? Because it was insane risk-taking. That it looks insane from the outside. It's hard to understand why someone would gamble with. He lucks into a $40 billion business, and then he basically gambles it away. Is nuts. That's the chief response of all the people. I don't know how Son's colleagues view him, but the chief response of all the people closest to Sam who suffered the most, lost everything kind of thing, and their reputations in the bargain, was like, why? I did, we thought you were more sensible than this. We thought that you'd protect what we had. I mean, there are people, it's very telling. There are people who work for him mainly the Asian employees, but COO types who were there from the very beginning, who were so sure of him that they talked all their family members, mom and dad, brothers and sisters, to put their money on FTX, and they did. When it all goes up in smoke, they just can't believe it. They misjudged. Actually, they just didn't listen to him, because he said often, like, if I think the expected value of any transaction is positive, I'll do it. They didn't quite believe that he believed the things he was saying, and it turned out he kind of did believe the things he was saying.
One of your first books, which I loved, in fact, I believe we extracted it on The Guardian, was the new thing. And in a way, you've spent the last 20 years of your life
writing. I embedded with Jim Clark, the
writing
same way
about,
I embedded with Sam Bankman-Fried.
Writing about new things. You're writing about these things that are very new and fresh. I'd be fascinated what you make of business journalism. I mean, how well do you think, for instance, business journalists cover the world of crypto, which is something that many people struggle to understand, and how well have they covered Silicon Valley and the internet, all these things that you've been writing about?
I mean, there are great writers out there doing great things. There is a trend, and the trend is, and it's a result of the bad economics of the media, but there's less and less funding for long-form, deep, immersive stuff. Like, the magazine world that used to sponsor this is on hard times. There used to be a half dozen places that could send you off for months, maybe more than that, months on end, to do Tom Wolfe or Hunter Thompson type stuff. And that it barely exists now. So you don't have the funding for it. I can do it because I'm rich. I can just go pay for it. That's what I did with this. I'm just funding my own reporting. But the young journalists coming up, me coming up, would not be sponsored in the way I was coming up, to go immerse myself in stories. It isn't just business journalism.
And has it become a harder world to cover? I mean, Lionel, you know much more about this than I do, but the business journalists on The Guardian, the whole thing had become so regulated, nobody was allowed to speak to anybody, all their phone calls were being traced. There was a massive PR industry protecting everybody. Has it become
funny you say this. So the first whiff of this I had was when we were writing a book called Flash Boys, and it was about this one guy's attempt he ended up creating an exchange. One guy's attempt to figure out what was going on in the stock market as it became automated, and it became overrun by high-frequency traders. And it's really profound what's happened to the market structures in financial markets. And it's resulted in the creation of massive wealth in the hands of the people who are doing most of the trading. Orders of magnitude greater than the guy who used to trade at Goldman Sachs, who used to be the guy at the center of the markets. And those people are unbelievably good and aggressive at preventing journalism from being done about them. I won't name names because I don't want to be in trouble, but one character in particular I know has shut down massive, very damning stories at big media outlets just with lawyers. And he has them, he's worth $40 billion or whatever he's worth, and the lawyers are nothing. And so if I try to write Liar's Poker right now, so I walked out of my Wall Street firm. I hadn't signed a non-disclosure agreement because they didn't exist or really exist. They certainly didn't imagine their employees needed to sign such things. And though it angered my bosses, or the people who ran the firm, that I wrote the book, no one sued me. No one threatened to sue me. Eventually, we'd go have dinner together to talk about it. There's a polite disagreement about like my feelings about the industry and their feelings about the industry, but I get to tell a story. It would be impossible now for someone to do this thing without being sued every which way, and they would have signed non-disclosure agreements. And it's just harder. It's a harder environment. I agree, especially when the people you're covering at the top of business just have so many more resources. And there is a kind of new norm that you fight the media rather than try to work with the media.
And that's true in the US as well as the UK.
It's definitely true in the US.
Yeah.
I assume it's always been a little more true in the UK because your libel laws
and we
strong.
don't have the First Amendment and all
right.
that. Yeah.
So, but it's hard to write hard truths about really rich people, and you just get in a lot of trouble. So I think it is. It's like what happens is the stories. It isn't that it's nothing, mainly nothing spectacular that you can see that happens. It's just like young, talented writers are sort of like dissuaded from looking in that place, so they go look somewhere else. So I think that it's not as rich a journalistic environment now. I think that's probably true.
So just to wrap up, Michael, what advice would you give to a young business or financial writer, apart from do a stint in a bank and then you actually might understand what you're talking about?
So that is a good advice for any young writer. It's like, go do things so you aren't just, you don't get used to this very bad habit in journalists that you're not going to really understand what you're writing about, that you're going to be operating on the basis of 2 or 3 interviews across a desk. You're not going to have the felt understanding of the people, of what the people are doing who you're writing about. So that's one thing. The second thing is, don't think of yourself as just a business or financial writer. Think of yourself as a writer who's happening into business and finance. Bring all of the tools that are used in, literature to the task. That'd be a second thing. And the third thing, is, this is related to the first, is as wicked as the environment is right now, and there's this presumption of hostility between subject and writer. If you can earn the trust of the people you're writing about, and there are ways to do it, and one way is to be kind of honest about what you're doing, people will let you in. I mean, people will, it's a pain in the neck to do it, but people will let you in. And you kind of got to be let in to understand what's going on. The stuff that's done from a distance always has this tinny feel. Everyone, I don't know how often you two have been written about, but anybody who comes in and interviews you for an hour and goes and does a profile, you read the profile and you go, the person doesn't really know me. How could they? They spent an hour with you and they interviewed some people. It's you got to get past that if you can do anything good.
So in the spirit of going infinite, I would add one other piece of advice, which is stay curious. Don't be cynical.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. You regard those as
Listen.
Opposites.
Well,
Yeah.
I think just start with the premise of listening in order to understand. The cynicism can come in the back end, maybe, but you've got to listen to understand.
Well, that's true. Withholding judgment, or rather withholding the kind of impulse to have a quick take on it, so you seem clever to your friends when you're talking about it, is really useful. I mean, so the other flip side of this problem with the media environment, Twitter or X, that it encourages everybody to have a view. It pays for hot takes, and the hot takes are almost necessarily, I mean, they might sound clever, but they're missing all kinds of things. And the problem is not just the hot take. The problem is the person who delivers the hot take is now anchored in the hot take. They can't change their mind. They're stuck with it. And so you have these kind of ecosystems of opinion that grow up around a take, and people then get very defensive about it. So they don't let new stuff in. So I would stay off of that if I were a business or financial journalist. Like, I don't think there's any, it's a negative value. Expressing your views all the time is going to screw up your storytelling.
Editors out there, take note.
What's your next book?
So there is an answer to that. I don't have my own big book subject, but I've written about a third of a book and curated the rest of it, and it's running in the Washington Post every week right now. And I've brought in 6 other writers, and we've parachuted them into the U.S. federal government to write stories about. The backdrop is, what could Trump screw up? But Trump isn't mentioned anywhere. But it's like, what actually goes on in this enterprise? Because the American people have no idea. And there are basically 7 profiles of people you've never heard of, but who are kind of riveting stories that would never get out. And it's a version or a kind of sequel to a book I wrote called The Fifth Risk that did this during the Trump administration. And that I found, to my just shock there was an appetite for. That for some reason there's this inefficiency in the journalistic marketplace for stories about government as opposed to politics, and that all this what gets covered is politics, but what matters is the government. And there's obviously a connection between the two, but people just forget about the government. And so you can go into, say, the Department of Agriculture, and you can find something that 1 million people want to read about. So that is coming out as a book in March. It's called Who is Government?
Can't wait. Thanks very much, Michael, for joining us.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, my pleasure.